Well, hello and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 2 of The Silver Chair. Jill is given a task.
I want to point out that you, in our notes, have this is chapter 1 of The Silver Chair, the picture in the bedroom.
I didn't fix the notes, all right, but I did know where we were, so I got that one taken care of.
I was pretty out of it.
It's great because we're getting all of our mistakes out of the way right now, especially with our special guest that we have today, Dr. Jared Henderson. Would you like to introduce yourself, sir?
Hi, yeah. One, you can call me Jared. I almost never go by doctor.
Yeah, so Jared, you have 2 podcasts that you host. So could you tell us a little bit about both of those?
Okay, yeah. So I am, as sort of a way of like framing it, here's a bit of my background so you can understand where I'm coming from here. Mm-hmm. So I have a PhD in philosophy. That's why I'm Dr. Jared Henderson. Though I'm not in academia anymore. I left after getting my PhD, and now I work in like AI. But shortly after ending my academic career and like finishing that up, I decided I wanted to start sharing some other passions that I have. And most of those are about like theology and literature. So I record these 2 podcasts. One of them I've been doing one of them a little bit longer than the other. The first one is Matins, and that is a podcast that's all about like Christian history and Christian books. And the idea there is that every single week we pick out a little passage from a different book or from part of the Bible or from letters. I mean, we've kind of done the gamut at this point. I read it, and then I sort of offer this reflection about it. I try to give some historical context every once in a while. I try to talk about the theology. It's fairly eclectic. I kind of just pick whatever I would like. Someone actually recently reached out to me and said it was because I picked so many strange topics and there wasn't a lot of continuity. They compared it to like an Anglican Joe Rogan, which I thought was...
That's amazing.
I don't listen to Joe Rogan, but he signed some giant contract with Spotify, so I'm flattered. And then the other podcast is Augustinian, which is a podcast that's just about St. Augustine, who's probably my favorite theologian. And kind of in the spirit of what you guys do, we're just doing chapter-by-chapter read-throughs of works by St. Augustine. Right now, we're in the middle of the Confessions. We're a little less than halfway through. So every 2 weeks, I'll do an episode that's about an hour long. And I don't read anything directly from it, but instead it's sort of a discussion of some major themes as they're developing in the Confessions.
And I am a huge fan of both of your podcasts, Jared. I kind of found Matins while searching. I don't remember exactly how I came across it. You've done a couple episodes on C.S. Lewis, and the one that really stood out to me was you worked through or talked through one of his letters to a former student, and it is... it's something I'd never read before, and you did such a great job kind of unpacking some of his reflections to this pupil who I think, correct me if I'm wrong, had recently converted to Christianity. Is that correct?
So I got it from this collection, The Letters of C.S. Lewis, and you don't always get a lot of context there because you can't see the other letters, and some have editorial notes, but this one doesn't. But from what I can gather from reading it, it sounds like it was a student of his who had recently converted and had reached out to Lewis and asked basically, what can I do as a new Christian? And Lewis gives him just really simple, but I think very profound advice, which is kind of Lewis's strong suit, finding the profound, but stating it simply. And in that episode, which I think is still my favorite episode, it was like episode 2, so I really peaked early. But he just goes through it and he says, like, if you want to live like a good Christian life, here's what I would suggest. Lays it out for him. And I absolutely love that. I'm a big fan of Lewis's letters anyways, and that's probably my favorite one. I read it often. I share it with people. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really great episode. And I'll link both of your podcasts in the description for listeners to find you, because I think what you do is so unique because it has this... Obviously, you have a background in academia, and you bring that to it. But I think you do really well, Jared, what you just said about Lewis, which is that you take these pretty lofty theological pieces often and then make them very simple and digestible, where a lot of times I will listen to matins on my morning commute. So it's like 6:30 in the morning and I'm like taking in St. John Chrysostom and I'm like, all right, here we go. I'm ready for Monday morning. And it doesn't feel overwhelming or burdensome. And so I'm really a big fan. I think a lot of our listeners will also like the work you're doing.
Oh, that's so good to hear. I really appreciate it. That's what I'm going for. Yeah. And that sort of Monday morning commute is like the ideal matin setting in my mind. So I'm glad you're getting something out of it.
And Augustinian's great too. I'm reading the Confessions along with you, and so I feel like now I'm kind of in the role of what listeners for our show, because I know a lot do read along with us. They read a chapter as they're getting ready for one of our episodes to come out, and so I read. I'm an episode or two behind right now of your show, but I've been reading as you go along, and it's been so much fun.
Oh, awesome. And that's okay to be behind, because I'm actually, maybe by the time this comes out, this won't be true, but I'm actually a week behind because I had some trouble editing the last one. So, we're going to catch up together.
Oh, great. That's wonderful to hear. Well, Jared, whenever we have guests on our show, we love to ask them 2 questions about the Chronicles of Narnia. So would you just tell us, we know a little bit more about you now. Can you tell us what your relationship is with these 7 books?
Okay, yeah. So I read some, but not all of the Chronicles of Narnia as a kid. I can't even remember which ones, but I know I never finished it, despite the fact that I know they were on my bookshelf. And I definitely read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and The Magician's Nephew. And The Magician's Nephew, when I was a kid, was just like the coolest thing. I don't know why that one stuck out to me. I also really liked those old BBC productions, which I believe you guys have been talking about on some of the bonus episodes.
Oh, yes.
I had those on VHS, and I watched especially the Voyage of the Dawn Treader one all the time. And because of this, I have this real love of Reepicheep. He's just like the coolest guy in Narnia, in my opinion. So as a kid, I was at least kind of into C.S. Lewis. I at least really liked this one video. However, I didn't read anything else by him for a really long time. And then it was around the time in grad school where I had sort of decided, I had sort of fallen out of going to church and stuff. And then I decided I wanted to go back around my second or third year of grad school. And then I started reading, and I thought, I remember reading some C.S. Lewis, and I know he wrote this other stuff. So I read Mere Christianity, and to be honest, I thought it was just okay. And I wasn't sure if I was gonna really like Lewis anymore. But then I read The Great Divorce and the Screw Tape Letters, and I really loved it. And then I started reading Lewis's letters, which I mentioned before. I have this collection. I just love to flip through them. I absolutely love this stuff. And also The Abolition of Man. And then last year, finally, I read the Space Trilogy. Everyone loves Narnia, and that's great. Narnia is this really wonderful series. But the Space Trilogy is just super cool, in my opinion. And since I found this other stuff, I decided I wanted to go back and reread all of the Narnia books. I just finished that up a couple of months ago. So it's been great. It's I kind of was into Lewis as a kid. I knew a little bit about him, but at this point, I'm a super fan. I've read practically everything I can.
Oh, that's awesome. That's really cool. What were your thoughts? This isn't one of the questions I wanted to ask you, but it has been kind of an ongoing thing on our podcast that I never finished, That Hideous Strength, and we've had many listeners tell me I need to finish it. Did you enjoy it? Did you find it difficult like I did compared to the first 2 books? It sounds like you're very passionate about this trilogy.
That Hideous Strength is, I think, at least at first, the weakest of the 3. However, the final couple of chapters, or maybe the back third of that book, is just really astounding. It's just a bit of a jarring reading experience because the first 2 we followed Ransom the whole time, and we've been in space, and then suddenly we're following this academic and his wife who are kind of falling into some stuff just on Earth, and it just doesn't seem as exciting, and it seems a little bit of a slog, and I certainly felt that, but I forced myself to finish it, and I think that was really a great move because the last couple of chapters are really astounding, and I think have a vision of Lewis's eschatology that's as clearly articulated as you would see in, for instance, at the end of the last battle, which I know you guys haven't gotten to, so I won't say too much. But this idea of like, what is the point? What are we all striving towards? Those kinds of questions start getting answered by Lewis in That Hideous Strength. So I recommend it to anybody.
I love that you said that, because obviously, like you said, we cannot talk about the last battle right now, but it's the thing that intrigues me most about the final book in the Chronicles of Narnia is diving into lots of Lewis's eschatological ideas. And to hear, I don't even think I ever thought about that inside the space trilogy, and maybe I didn't get that far. I don't remember how far I got into the book. And so now I'm like, oh, that's a good reason for me to revisit it. So I know I need to pick it back up soon.
Well, yeah, you see it a little bit in the second book in the space trilogy, during these big songs and things at the end, when there's like this rebirth of Venus, or like actually the real birth of Venus, because it hasn't actually been born in some sense. And what's great about the end of That Hideous Strength is actually you start seeing glimpses of that. There's this weird thing though that Lewis takes pains to talk about in That Hideous Strength, which is that so for Venus there is no need for like redemption, because there is no fall, and that's what ransom helps prevents. However, the whole universe has changed because of the incarnation, and so because of what happens on Earth, even though it's like cut off from the rest of the solar system in that trilogy, what has happened there is in some sense happening everywhere. And that's what's really profound about it, because it's like this on Matins I talk about the incarnation all the time. It's like what I probably say it's the most important thing every other episode or something, but it comes out in that book because it's basically like people are astounded to think that this one planet could fall, and then to save it, God becomes man, and that's just like blowing everyone's mind. And in That Hideous Strength, they really talk about it.
Oh, that's so great! I love that. Well, can you answer this other question for us, Jared, which is you just recently finished rereading all the books and reading some of them for the first time. Which book was your favorite and why?
Oh, yeah. So I think that if I have to pick, like just right now, it's really, really hard, but I would say The Last Battle. I think that is this sense of despair that's in that book, but then at the end, this huge hope. It's the one Narnia book that made me cry. And I don't cry at books that often. But the last chapter, I was actually in tears. However, I really love The Silver Chair as well. It's pretty close.
Yeah. Well, great. That's exciting. I am so excited for us to dive into The Last Battle. It was the one that I did not really remember much except for the last few chapters. I definitely remember that as a kid, but I reread it, a couple of years ago as we were beginning the podcast, and I was like, wow, this is it is a unique book. So I can't say anything else. Sorry, Phil. I know this isn't fun for you.
Well, it is. It makes me want to go read a bunch of other stuff. Daniel just got me the first book of the space trilogy, and I feel like there's a lot of Lewis literature out there that I can explore after we finish these books.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jared, this is not a question we usually ask people, but I just figured since we have you on the show, you have so much knowledge around Christian history, and one of the running it's not a gag because it's a mistake. I regularly mispronounce words on our show. I didn't know this was a part of my personality until we started recording my voice, and then I learned that I can't even pronounce words like wolf. There are two very, very famous Augustines in Christian history. There's St. Augustine of Hippo, right from the 4th century, and then St. Augustine of Canterbury from the 6th century, the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Are both of them actually pronounced Augustine? I hear some people say Augustine, some people say Augustine. I figured you could finally give us the how do we say this name?
Okay, cool. So let me give you a bit of a funny story by way of answering this.
Yes, please.
If you listen to the promo for Augustinian, the short 2 or 3 minute promo that I released just to get things on the feed, you will hear me call him St. Augustine. And I have never gotten more listener feedback about anything than people contacting me to tell me that I said it wrong. So much so that I had already recorded episode 1, and I went and re-recorded every bit where I said Augustine's name to then say Augustine. I have now gotten so much listener feedback that tells me that actually it's Augustine. I have heard also from people who I would think would know their stuff that Augustine is of Hippo and Augustine is of Canterbury, and also that Augustine is of Hippo and Augustine is of Canterbury.
Oh, goodness.
I have heard from both of these. My official position is I say Augustine for both, just because I already occasionally still slip up and say Augustine, and I'm trying to avoid it, so I'm just going to always say Augustine. And second, these are Latin names that we're then putting into English, so the pronunciation is just going to be weird anyways. We're not saying it like Augustine would have said his name.
Okay.
And so I'm just not that concerned anymore. But I say Augustine because it's where I get less listener feedback when I say Augustine.
Augustine. Okay.
So no, I'm caving to the mob, but
no, that's really helpful. And it's actually funny you mentioned one of those in my, I teach ancient and medieval history, and in my classes, I usually say St. Augustine if I'm referring to St. Augustine of Hippo, and then St. Augustine if I'm discussing, the man who was part of bringing Christianity to Britain, just because it helps my students to be like, look, I know they're the same name, but we're just going to call it, and I just kind of guess. Like, I know that sounds awful as a teacher, but I was like, I couldn't figure it out. I watched a billion videos, and everybody's saying it differently. So it makes me feel better to realize that there does not seem to be a consensus here.
It also helps. I've got a lot of family in Florida, and it helps if I just reserve St. Augustine to mean that place on the coast.
Yeah, for the city.
And then Augustine will just always be a saint.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, this is very helpful, and it's helping me pronounce things correctly on the show. So, although I don't know how often we're going to ever come back to St. Augustine at this point, so we'll find a way to work him in. Well, this has been great getting to know you, Jared, and kind of understanding your background. And I think now is a great time for us to go ahead and jump into Chapter 2 here of The Silver Chair. So, Phil, do you want to go ahead and take us away with the chapter summary?
Sure. Still reeling from seeing Eustace fall off the cliff, Jill gets up and looks around. She is terribly thirsty and carefully approaches the stream, but stops at the sight of the lion she had seen moments before. He tells her to drink, and she enjoys the most refreshing water she has ever had. The lion questions her about what happened to Eustace, and instructs her not to show off again, and informs her that as a consequence, her task will be more difficult. Elaborating, he reveals that there are 4 things she must remember to do. He makes sure she can recite them, then with a gentle breath sends her flying west to Narnia. The journey is quite long, but is comfortable enough for her to sleep. She wakes up, goes through a few more clouds, then lands safely among fantastical scenery and next to her friend Eustace.
Very nice. How many words was that? That was a long one, it felt like.
Yeah, 146. Wanted there to be a little bit of breathing room. Didn't want it to go on and on.
Sorry, it sounded like I was insulting you by saying it was a long one. That's not what I meant. It just, you did a good job kind of expounding, and we'll get to this in a minute. A lot of stuff doesn't actually happen in this chapter, but yet she
falls for about 2 pages.
That's true. Well, what are some of y'all's kind of initial takeaways here?
So one reason that I wanted to talk about this chapter is because I love actually that there's this kind of this duality in the chapter, which is that Jill, along with Eustace, though the focus is on Jill right now, has been called by Aslan, and now Jill is being sent. And there's this nice kind of reversal of what's happening. She gets called to this mountain, right? So she's on this mountain that's like super high, as they talk about in chapter 1. But then she only gets to be there for a while. She's there so that she can refresh herself, and then she can be sent. And that was something that I think kind of frames the chapter really well for me, and kind of helps me think through the long discussion that Jill has. Because, as you said, like not much action. There's not much action here. However, there is a lot of like deep conversation between Jill and Aslan, possibly deeper than we've gotten in any of the books so far, or at least this is unusual. Aslan is often very cryptic, and he gives Jill paragraphs.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that too, and also just having been on retreats and stuff, when you're at the retreat, everything seems very clear, and then when you get back to the real world, it's a little harder to remember what you should be focusing on. And I love how clearly that was stated here, and how he talks to her directly, and he makes sure that she's able to remember like what her tasks are going to be. And he also warns her. He's like, hey, it's going to be different once you get there. Things aren't going to be like you think they might be.
Yeah, I mean, Jill literally has a mountaintop experience here with Aslan, and then she's sent out into the world to then carry out the charge with which he has given her. I mean, it's so weird because both Aslan is not speaking cryptically. He's being very open. And this is juxtaposed with the last book we had where Aslan is more like God in Esther, where it's like, I mean, Aslan barely showed up the whole book. And then now here he is in the second chapter. He probably speaks more than anyone else in the whole chapter. And this is so different than the last book, as then he sends her out. And it's and in the same way, it feels like Lewis is giving us so much more exposition than he usually does, that kind of in some ways mirrors the way that Aslan is just telling us so much. Lewis, like, here's the plot of the book. It's just like this. Here's what's going to happen. We've got this prince we've got to find, and now it's time to go out. And there's a lot of clarity here on the top of this mountain that we haven't really seen much in Narnia before.
Yeah, I think I was looking through some of Lewis's letters to just see where he mentions the silver chair, and it only comes up a couple of times. But in one of them, he mentions that when writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he wasn't sure of the religious significance yet. It sort of developed as he was writing. But then as the books progress, he's able to really develop the religious, he wouldn't say allegory, but something like the supposition. And I think that in the silver chair, it becomes like crystal clear. So there's obviously a lot of religious allegory that happens in the earlier books, but in this, like you said, like there's like a mountaintop experience. This is like Moses going to the top of the mountain to receive the law, or like the scene of the Transfiguration, or Jesus on the Mount, right? Like people go to the mountain to talk to God. Jill has been called to the mountain, and that's where Aslan speaks super clearly.
Exactly, and we see at the very end as she is blown off of this cliff into Narnia that it appears to be that, and she's moving westward, by the way. It appears to be that she is in those mountains that Eustace and Lucy and Edmund saw at the very end of the Dawn Treader. As they're looking up and they're seeing into Aslan's country where the peaks of the mountains don't have snow on them, although they're extremely tall. This seems to be actually where she is, that she's starting in Aslan's country and being sent out into Narnia itself.
Yeah, Jill has a completely different Narnia experience than any of the other children so far, because they kind of like learn about the world of Narnia and then discover that there's this great guy or this great lion, Aslan, and Jill like encounters Aslan first and then gets to go to Narnia, which is a very different kind of experience.
Mm-hmm. So let's jump in here to the chapter now. And Jill begins the chapter really upset, obviously. She's seen Eustace fall off this cliff. It's kind of her fault, too. And so just like the first chapter begins, she sits down and she just starts mourning. She starts crying over and over again. And Jared, last time in chapter 1, we talked about the Narnia codes. Are you familiar with Dr. Michael Ward's theory that each book here in this series has some kind of relation to one of the medieval heavens?
I'm not familiar, actually.
So no, that's fine. It's always great to go back over it. So the quick explanation is that Michael Ward, a professor at Oxford, he wrote a book called Planet Narnia about 10 years ago. And in this book, he argues that Lewis structured the Chronicles of Narnia around the 7 heavens of the medieval cosmology. We're not entirely convinced, but we enjoy discussing it nonetheless. So in the last episode, Phil and I learned that this book is supposedly related to the moon, specifically as it relates to water. And so we're looking for allusions to water throughout the book.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's just the imagery that like sort of dominates this. I guess there are sort of 2 main things. There's a lot of stuff about the air, but then water as well. So like the stream that I'm sure we'll talk about soon.
Yeah. Well, why don't we go ahead and talk about that stream that is here at the beginning of the chapter. Jill, as she kind of comes to, it's not that she's fallen asleep, but that as she kind of collects herself, she realizes how dreadfully thirsty she is. And she hears, like you said, she hears this stream. And as she goes looking for it, she eventually finds it, but right across from the stream is a lion. And this is where the conversation between Aslan and Jill that takes us throughout pretty much the whole rest of the chapter begins. Let's dive into, what are some of your thoughts here on Jill and this thirstiness that she has?
What's interesting, I think, is that, I mean, I don't know how long Jill and Eustace have been on the mountain so far. I don't know if it's like explicitly said or if it's inferred or implied in some place. And if one of you knows, that would be great. But that she has gone from crying and such, and now she feels like she's dying of thirst. So it's not just that she's thirsty, but it describes it as her thirst was very bad now, and she had to pluck up all of her courage just to go look for water. She's described as tiptoeing, and so the thirst is so strong that it's like a powerful motivation for her action. But it's very sudden as well, which is kind of a strange move in the narrative.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because it is unclear how much time has passed, and even here on this mountaintop, we don't even know that time's working the same way. I mean, we're in Narnia now. For all we know, time is acting differently. But you're right. She goes from, and it's not just, oh, I'm really thirsty. She says to Aslan, when she eventually gets to the stream, I am dying of thirst. And the word dying is italicized. I mean, it is really, Lewis is really telling us this is an intense need of hers. And that's where we get to this scene of her wanting to go down to this stream and drink from it, but at the same time being absolutely terrified that, there's a giant lion across on the other side of the stream.
Mm-hmm. And I love the progression that you see in what Aslan says, because she's very scared, but I highlighted these so we could see this. First, Aslan says to her, if you're thirsty, you may drink. And then she doesn't. And he turns it into, if you are thirsty, come and drink. And then he asks, are you not thirsty? She says that she's dying of thirst. And he says, then drink. And then finally has to tell her, there is no other stream. So it's like he keeps, the rhetoric is sort of ratcheted up with each iteration to sort of put, I think, some pressure here to say, like, Jill, you're dying of thirst. Like, you're willing to admit this. And I am standing by the one source of life for you. And she still has to pluck up like a lot of courage.
That fits with the progression of how thirsty she is. She's dreadfully thirsty, and then when she gets near the stream, it increases 10 times. And then, like you said, she eventually says she's dying of thirst. It seems like her body is becoming more aware of what she needs.
And yet at the same time, she's also becoming more aware of the role that Aslan, who she just calls him the lion at this point. And Lewis could just call him the lion at this point as well, too. She becomes more aware of kind of his role in all of this. I mean, she even realizes that she can't, Lewis says she might as well have asked the whole mountain to move aside for her convenience. And as this progresses, there's a very clear parallel way back to Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Mrs. Beaver reminds us that Aslan is not safe. Of course he isn't safe, right? But he's good. Mm-hmm. And she's like, do you promise not to do anything to me? And Aslan says, I make no promise. And she says, do you eat girls? And Aslan's response is, I have swallowed up girls and boys, women and men, kings and emperors, cities and realms. And Lewis goes on to say, it didn't say this as if it were boasting, nor as if it were sorry, nor as if it were angry. It just said it. And to me, I think there are some clear parallels between Moses on the mountaintop, and we'll get to this, even like the Israelites receiving the law as we get to these 4 signs. There's also this kind of burning bush supposal or allegory here, where it's just Aslan saying, well, I am. This is who I am. I think even at one point he does respond to one of her questions with just the phrase "I am." I can't remember where exactly that's in there or not, but I think he does. When she says, "Then you are somebody, sir." This is later on, and he responds, "I am."
I also think that there's a lot of very powerful baptismal imagery going on here. It's helpful if you think about Lewis's religious context, because he was a member of the Church of England, and at the time they were still using the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. And it's really nice to actually go back and look at what the baptismal rite was like either when you were bringing an infant or if you were an adult coming. Because what you have to do in that rite is you make a lot of promises to God rather than God making a lot of promises to you. The idea is actually that the promise is the water, or that's the sign of the promise. There is no spoken promise from God here, but you have to make a lot of promises to God first, or if you're baptizing an infant, those people are making the promises on the infant's behalf. And so Lewis wants to ask, or Jill wants to ask for promises. She wants to ask for a conditionless access to this water, and Aslan is just saying, no, I don't do that. But you can come to the water if you want it, and it's just going to take a little bit, right? That water quenches her thirst with just a little bit of it. It's like a christening where you just have to take a cup of water and pour it over an infant's head.
That is such a great point. I had not picked up on any of the baptismal imagery here. And, being familiar with the Book of Common Prayer too, I'm actually not super familiar with 1662, but you're right. Just, the way especially that Lewis would have drawn heavily on that, just with, a more sacramental worldview as well too. And it's hard for me, just as you just said, it's hard to unsee that in this chapter.
Yeah, I think this is kind of a nice accompaniment to a chapter in Voyage of the Dawn Treader when they find themselves at that table and the food replenishes itself, which has like really strong Eucharistic imagery to it.
Yeah.
And then now we're having sort of what the waters of baptism are like. And it makes sense because Jill is in some sense, she grew up, or she's being educated at Experiment House. Experiment House explicitly does not swear on the Bible. Bibles aren't allowed at Experiment House. It's a very newfangled, like humanist kind of education. Exactly. Something that Lewis hates, and you can see it from that chapter and other writings. And so now she's been brought to Narnia, or she's in Aslan's country. She is encountering Aslan, the creator of this world, and she needs to be initiated in some sense. And baptism in this kind of sacramental worldview is an initiation into the body of Christ. And so that's what Aslan is offering her.
One of the beautiful things that Lewis does is all of this is wrapped up within almost layer upon layer of different, allegorical or supposition. And because at the same time as all this is happening, it's hard to not hear Aslan say, there is no other stream, and not to think about something like John 14, say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Like this is it. This is what you have to come to. I mean, there's so many different things, especially just because water is such a strong image throughout the Bible. I mean, there's so many different times where water is used, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, that it feels like Lewis is just really, really letting loose. And I think that's to your point, Jared. It seems like he really has a much better idea of what kind of the theological implications are here in this book than, back in Wardrobe, where it was kind of, Aslan is kind of like Jesus coming back, but then other things don't make sense. And here, actually, a lot of the things line up, and it just feels like it's almost pretty heavy coming on.
Mm-hmm. And don't forget, they came to Narnia through a small door that not many people could get through.
Yes.
And the idea of the narrow door is an allusion used in the Gospels.
Absolutely, yeah. So before we move into the introduction of these four signs, do we have any other thoughts here on the beginning of this conversation between Aslan and Jill?
One thing I want to draw attention to is that, Aslan says to Jill, after she has drank the water, she is refreshed, she only needed a little bit, and he asks her actually to explain what she did wrong. She actually says that she can admit what she did wrong. He tells her not to do it again. This is a very go and sin no more kind of moment. Mm-hmm. And then it says, now you have a task. So she has been brought into Aslan. She has been initiated in Aslan's country, and now she's going to be sent out to go do things. But I really love this little line that happens where Jill says, I was wondering, could there be some mistake? Because nobody called me and Scrub, It was we who asked to come here. Scrub said we were to call to somebody. It was a name I wouldn't know, and perhaps that somebody would let us in, and we did, and then we found the door open. And Aslan replies with, you would not have called to me unless I had been calling to you. And the salvific imagery that you're getting here, you've already got it with baptism, but this idea that conversion happens when someone wants to come to God, but the very Christian idea is that you can't want to come to God unless God wants you to come to him. God takes the first step here, and Aslan has taken this first step. Jill and Eustace have made their way to Narnia, in part because they took action, but what allowed them to take that action and what allowed it to be so efficacious and to come to Aslan's country now is Aslan calling them. I love this little. These are 4 sentences, and they're just great.
Do you think, Jared, that there is any kind of, and so I grew up Presbyterian before becoming Anglican, and for me, I hear some of this too, and I hear some of, and Lewis obviously is not a Calvinist, but I hear some kind of like Calvinistic language here, and kind of like you wouldn't have been able to come to me if I hadn't come to you. Or am I reading too much into that? Do you think that's maybe some of what Lewis is alluding to here?
So I'm skeptical of calling it a Calvinist. In part because when you read Lewis's letters and he mentions Calvinism, he usually mentions it not super critically, at least from what I've read, but as rather unimportant. He doesn't think that it really matters to talk about the issue of predestination.
Okay.
But I think that the idea that God calls to us and allows us to respond is actually it's a broader just Christian idea. This idea of prevenient grace that you find in other traditions that aren't Calvinist, and this idea that through the incarnation and then through the presence of the Holy Spirit, anybody could be called, and there is a matter of response. This kind of stuff, I think you can find this in Catholic theology, you can find this in classical Anglican theology, you can find it in Presbyterianism. So I wouldn't read too much into it, though. To be honest, I am usually hesitant to read too much like very specific theology into Lewis. So I know I just talked about baptism and things, but he often called himself a mere Christian, and I think that I tend to try to read the books like that and not try to suss out very, very particular theological points. But that might just be my own hesitancy. I'm really not sure.
Yeah, so we got to have you back for Last Battle, especially because there's so many aspects of that book where Lewis discusses different aspects where people try to figure out what his views on eschatology and even salvation were from that book. And I think you're right, though, that it isn't super helpful to read into very specific doctrines here in the book because, as we've stated from like the very beginning of our podcast, Lewis has said this is not an allegory. Please stop reading it as an allegory. We use, supposition or a supposal, right, is the word we try to go for, because that makes more sense than this, here is exactly what he's saying. So I think you're right to read into that.
And I think also to just draw a parallel with the Great Divorce. So, in the Great Divorce, this is this discussion about, it seems like it's about the afterlife. It seems like it's about purgatory and heaven and hell. Mm-hmm. But if you read the introduction to it, Lewis actually says that he is hesitant to take this as a description of what life after death may be. And I think that there's a very good reading of The Great Divorce where it's actually about practical theology and about practical ethics, and doesn't commit him to a particular view about purgatory. I might be in the minority of thinking this, but I think that Lewis really likes to take on these grand theological and philosophical claims, but then translate them into the practical Christianity that, say, an Englishman of his time would have had to deal with, or what children might be expected to deal with.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons that so many of us love Lewis, no matter where our background is, because we all find parts of our theology in Lewis, kind of no matter across the board, whether all the way from Catholic, Orthodox, all the way into so many different denominations that are Protestant. We all find parts of Lewis because he kind of, it sounds derogatory to say it this way, but he kind of beat around the bush on a lot of issues, and I don't think that was his intention often. Although with a lot of like mere Christianity, he's saying no, like I'm not going to get into these big issues. And in fact, Phil and I got to hear a professor speak about it. I can't remember who it was at the symposium that we went to last fall, kind of talk about where he sent all of his copies of Mere Christianity to an Orthodox, Anglican, and Catholic priest, and wouldn't put anything in the book that all three of them wouldn't sign off on, because he wanted it to be as broad and as appealing to the masses as possible.
Oh, that's very cool. I mean, I think Lewis has particular theological beliefs and thinks that eventually you have to make your mind up. But like he's introducing you into a mansion with many rooms. Mere Christianity is like the hallway, and he's just going to get you into that hallway, and then you got to pick a room.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, I guess we have to go ahead and talk about this very large exposition dump that occurs through these 4 signs. So I'm going to go ahead and actually read the signs to us, and then we can walk through what's happening here. So this is Aslan talking. These are the signs by which I will guide you in your quest. First, as soon as the boy Eustace sets foot in Narnia, he will meet an old and dear friend. He must greet that friend at once. If he does, you will both have good help. Second, you must journey out of Narnia to the north till you come to the ruined city of the ancient giants. Third, you shall find a writing on a stone in that ruined city, and you must do what the writing tells you. Fourth, you will know the lost prince, if you find him, by this, that he will be the first person you have met in your travels who will ask you to do something in my name, in the name of Aslan. As the lion seemed to have finished, Jill thought she should say something, so she said, "Thank you very much, I see."
This is so different than the first 2 books. Just like we have our tasks that we have to accomplish right away.
Exactly, and it kind of tells us, it lays out how the plot is supposed to go, at least. Obviously, just from like a literary perspective, this is something I think about with my students. I mean, how often are we reading through a text where it's like, okay, here's what's supposed to happen to solve everything? And that's a pretty rare thing in a book like this. And obviously, that doesn't necessarily mean that it'll all happen correctly this way, but the fact that here in, about 20 pages into the book, we're being told, here's exactly what needs to happen in order for the story to be successful.
And I think also the reader can hear this and say, oh, okay, so there are 4 conditions. I bet they're not going to meet all 4. I bet something's going to go wrong.
Absolutely. So that's the kind of stuff I would push my students towards. Like, all right, let's make some predictions. Who thinks that all 4 of these things are good? And that wouldn't be very fun. No one really wants to read a book that's like, hey, here's exactly what's going to happen. Hope you enjoy the ride along the way.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, as I was reading through this and, with all of the kind of mountaintop experiences we've been talking about, it was really hard for me not to make a connection between the Israelites receiving the law in the Old Testament. And, I wasn't surprised when I went to some of the, regular academics that we often go to on the show to find that, many of them had obviously also made this connection. And I thought Peter Shakel actually really put it very eloquently. So I just want to read really quickly just 2 sentences from his book, The Way into Narnia. Here's what Dr. Shakel says. The signs become for Jill what the words of the law were for Israel, a source of direction and guidance, and she must keep them before her at all times. As the Israelites found freedom through obedience to the law, so obedience to Aslan's directives will lead to inner freedom for Jill and Eustace and freedom from slavery for the prince. And so I think it'll be really interesting for us throughout the book to kind of see the ways in which this allusion to the law in the Old Testament continues throughout the book, or if this is, like it totally could be for Lewis, this could be just, oh no, this is just this chapter, and then that supposition completely falls apart, by chapter 3. It'll be interesting to see if that holds up. Phil, while we're talking about these signs, you have obviously not read this book as an adult, and I have to ask you, what is your what are your thoughts on what these mean and what this could mean for the story itself? Not really necessarily knowing where we're going to go in the book.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking. I thought, this might be a little bit more clear cut. There are 4 things they have to do. Now we'll just check them off, and then we'll be done. And I think that as a kid, that's what I really wanted, or I thought I wanted. I wanted all the characters to do exactly what they were supposed to and for everything to work out and there not to be any conflict. And then as I started to study story, as a concept later on, I realized you have to have conflict. Something like you can't have everything go right. And if you look at the structure of almost every film, there's the original plan and then something goes wrong and now you're off on an adventure. So I'm really curious if we'll even get this first one, because it sounds like there's a pretty tight window that she has to communicate with Eustace before that friend is going to show up, and I'm really curious to see what will happen. My guess is that possibly all 4 of these will not work out.
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask you. Do you think any of these will happen the way they're supposed to? Give me a number. How many of these happen correctly?
0.
0. Okay.
Yeah.
How much you want to bet?
I don't know.
How about
you
have
lose?
to edit the rest of the season if you're wrong?
Oh gosh, I wouldn't.
I'm just kidding.
None of us want that.
So Aslan then gives this final charge to Jill, saying he tells her 2 things. He tells her to remember the signs, to repeat them over and over again. And I think there's some pretty clear allusions to the memorization of Scripture here. And then he gives her a warning, which is that, as we mentioned earlier, he's not going to speak as clearly once she gets down to Narnia. And then she needs to take great care to not confuse things and to make sure she is kind of fixing her eyes upon these signs or upon the law, if you will.
I think it's really that her repeating it is a good point, or bringing that up. In part, when Lewis gives advice to that new Christian in that letter we talked about, one of the things he says is that there are certain things you need to say every day. He mentions the Lord's Prayer as one of them. Mm-hmm. And then also, if he's familiar at all with like the daily office in the Book of Common Prayer, that the whole idea is that there are certain things you are going to repeat to yourself in prayer every single day. While there is variation based on like what you're reading, for instance, you're always going to say the Apostles' Creed and you're always going to say the Lord's Prayer. Mm-hmm. And in some sense, you are reminding yourself of what you believe and you are reminding yourself of what you ought to do. So Jill, the first thing she has to do when she wakes up, like morning prayer, and the first thing she has to do before she goes to bed, like evening prayer, is repeat these commandments from Aslan.
That's such a great way to put it, and I hadn't thought of it contextualized in Lewis's particular practice of Anglicanism, because that is, that would make sense in this for Jill to kind of be treating it that way. I like that idea. All right, Phil. So what happens next after it's time for Jill to go?
He sends her on her way, but she's on her way before she even realizes it.
Yeah, this is such an interesting kind of final part to the chapter, because like you said already, we spend about 2 minutes with her flying through the air. It actually reminds me of the beginning of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And there's actually a couple of different connections here, because, both Jill and Alice, I feel like actually both of them act kind of the same way in this new world, where there's like this like curiosity, but also this kind of like, I'm just kind of fed up with all of this as well. And, as Alice is falling through the rabbit hole, she herself falls asleep. She keeps like, I wonder if this will ever end. She starts thinking about some of her schooling, and I wonder if Lewis, our Lewis, C.S. Lewis, Jack, was thinking it all, making any connections between something that he obviously would have been very familiar with, which is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, in this kind of sending out into this new world. Because just like with both girls, Jill and Alice, this is kind of I know Jill has already been in this magical world, but she hasn't technically been in Narnia yet. And this is her traveling into that world, just like Alice travels through the rabbit hole all the way into Wonderland.
Yeah, there has to be that influence, at least somewhat, right?
I don't know. We're novices, dude. But then she does eventually land. There is a lot of imagery here of water. She's going through the clouds, the cold, wet fogginess that we hear. She looks down. She sees the water below her eventually. And then as she eventually lands on the riverside, her last exclamation here is, "How wet I am," after she's, kind of gone through all this water.
It's kind of a shame. You can see that she's already sort of being set up for failure, because she was told that she has to remember certain things from Aslan, these 4 directives. And then when she finally finds Scrub, she has 2 thoughts, which is that he looks bad and that she's very wet.
Neither of those are, I have to tell him to find his old dear friend.
Exactly. I'm curious, actually. I don't understand the Aslan's breath imagery that gets used here. It was also in chapter 1. I know it has appeared elsewhere, but it seems like such an emphasis on Aslan's breath. It's what blows the wind, and it's what blows Eustace to safety, and then Jill to Narnia. But it feels significant in some way, but I have no idea. And I don't read a lot of the Narnia scholarship like you guys do, so maybe you can enlighten me.
Before it seemed like when he was breathing on the statues, it was more of a Holy Spirit thing. I'm having trouble connecting the Holy Spirit to traveling long distances. What are your thoughts?
There's some kind of connection with like missionary work. Here's what you're saying, Phil.
I guess so. I guess
that's actually not a bad connection because the gift of the Holy Spirit comes in Pentecost, and then the church is sent out, right? So if there is this kind of structure of being called and then being sent, if the breath is the Holy Spirit in this imagery, then it makes sense. They've now been sent on a mission. I can at least see it.
Yeah, we've talked about that back in Wardrobe and the penultimate chapter there when Aslan is breathing life back into the statues. We've discussed, and I think Paul Ford also talks about this in the Companion to Narnia, that he makes some allusions to that this is kind of the Holy Spirit in that story. And even in Wardrobe, where things are a little hard to understand what some of the supposals are, you have kind of the emperor across the sea as God the Father. You have, you have Jesus as this Aslan character, and then you have the breath as the Holy Spirit. And we see that a little bit too in Dawn Treader, because remember Lucy, as she is speaking to the albatross, there's that there's like this smell. There's a description. Yeah, here's actually from the Dark Island in chapter 12 of Dawn Treader. Here is what it says. And again, we know it's important, Phil, because over 500 people have highlighted it in their Kindles. So here's that very, very famous line. But no one except Lucy knew that as it circled the mast, referring to the albatross, it had whispered to her, "Courage, dear heart." And the voice she felt sure was Aslan's. And with a voice, a delicious smell breathed in her face. And so again, there's this kind of description of breath that seems to be, I think we can make some connections to the Holy Spirit. So that's what my thoughts are 4 books in, is that the breath of Aslan has used to kind of give us some imagery of the Holy Spirit in Narnia.
That sounds at least reasonably plausible.
Yeah, yeah, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, what I do on my podcast, honestly, is just like spitball some thoughts that I had and then maybe reconsider them one time. So you guys have now done more thinking about this issue than I've done on almost anything else I say. So
that's totally fine. Yeah. Well, Phil, before we wrap up, did you want to read this last paragraph or so and get some of Lewis's words in here before we go?
Sure. Suddenly the land opened up right ahead of her. She was coming to the mouth of a river. She was very low now, only a few feet above the water. A wave top came against her toe, and a great splash of foam spurted up, drenching her nearly to the waist. Now she was losing speed. Instead of being carried up the river, she was gliding into the river bank on her left. There were so many things to notice that she could hardly take them all in. A smooth green lawn, a ship so brightly colored that it looked like an enormous piece of jewelry. Towers and battlements, banners fluttering in the air, a crowd, gay clothes, armor, gold, swords, a sound of music. But this was all jumbled. The first thing that she knew clearly was that she had alighted, and was standing under a thicket of trees close by the riverside, and there, only a few feet away from her, was Scrub. The first thing she thought was how very grubby and untidy and generally unimpressive he looked, and the second was, how wet I am.
And I think to your point, Jared, it's such a... I don't think I'd realized, how quick she is to already have forgotten that she has a task to do. And, her first 2 thoughts have nothing to do with the charge that she's been given by Aslan.
Which is, for the reader, it's frustrating and you want to kind of shake her. But if you think about your own life, how many times you've come to a realization about what you ought to do, and then the second you become uncomfortable, you can easily get distracted. So it's a very human experience.
Yeah, speak for yourself, Jared. This has never happened to me. I've never made these bad decisions. No, this is so relatable. Absolutely.
The ones that would always happen for me after a quote mountaintop experience would be we would go on a retreat, but then you have to drive back, and the drive back is awful because you're like a little behind on sleep and you're kind of packed in the car with a bunch of people, and it's very easy to kind of forget what you just learned. Or like what you were trying to keep in mind. And then you get back home and you have to unpack and you're tired and cranky and stuff. And then you go back to school or work the next day. And I'm right there with her. I can understand how You fly through the air for a while, go through a few clouds, and then you completely forget what your mission was.
That's true. So Phil, what do you think, before we finish the chapter, what do you think is going to happen next? And I'll give you a hint that in the next chapter, Eustace will meet an old and dear friend. That's our chapter 3 little summary. What do you think is going to happen next?
I think he'll meet the friend, but he will not greet them correctly, and everything will immediately be thrown off, and it'll make the next 3 tasks more difficult.
Okay, very interesting. Good thoughts. Well, Phil and Jared, any final thoughts on this chapter before we head over to read an email?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well.
I just want to reiterate this on the record. For the next book, Daniel has not read it as an adult, and I think that I should read the whole thing, and then I get to do this.
That could be fun. That could be a fun thing.
Even things out a little bit. And every time you give an answer, I'll be like, wow, okay, yeah, interesting. And me and the readers will just be laughing
condescend towards you. Like, oh, yeah, maybe, who knows?
Yeah, we don't know.
And you guys are reading in publication order, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So is that The Horse and This Boy? Is that what's
Yes.
Oh,
so neither of us have read that as adults. And I have said many times, I don't remember if I read it as a kid or not. But even if I did, I remember almost nothing except that there's 2 children and 2 horses. And that's it.
Yeah, well, okay. You remember something.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. I looked at the title of the book and I figured out a couple of things.
Okay, so as we wrap up here, I have an email. This is the subject line. Daniel, you'll love this. The Dufflepuds and Jar Jar.
Yeah, I like one of those things in the subject line.
Yeah, we'll leave that up to our listeners, which one it is.
Yeah, I should say I don't actively dislike one of those things. I'm not fans really of either, but
okay.
Go ahead. Sorry.
So this is from Anna. Hi, Daniel and Phil. I've just listened to Chapter 10 of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader again, and would like to share some memories and thoughts with you. Narnia will always hold some of the most precious childhood memories of my dad reading all 7 books to me and my younger brothers as bedtime stories. Now, I was a little shocked to hear how much you dislike the Dufflepuds, Daniel. When I was a kid, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader was my favorite book for the sole reason of the Dufflepuds. Little 8-year-old me was scared of the invisible voices and the mysterious smoke on the island, but was delighted by the silly creatures behind them. I peeled with laughter over these funny characters, with their stupidity, over planting baked potatoes, their huge feet, and their backwards way of talking. I just loved them. However, as an adult, I can understand why they could be seen as annoying and somewhat unnecessary characters. As a huge Star Wars fan, too, I can draw a parallel between the Dufflepuds and Jar Jar Binks. I was also around 8 years old when I saw The Phantom Menace. I thought Jar Jar was hilarious and one of my favorite parts of the movie, but now I can't stand him, much like many Star Wars fans. But Narnia and Star Wars are ultimately meant for children, and these characters from C.S. Lewis and George Lucas bring comic relief to their stories, and big laughs for kids, no matter how annoying they are for grown-ups. I cannot let go of my nostalgia for the Dufflepuds, so I'll still love their characters forever, but I can drop Jar Jar any day. Thus ends my defense for the Dufflepuds. Side note, Duffer, one of the Dufflepuds' alternative names, is a term of endearment in Australia, and I also assume in England. It means someone who's very bad at something or clumsy. If someone drops something or doesn't get a joke, you say, "Oh, you silly duffer." Maybe the Dufflepuds/Duffers were supposed to be endearing characters that make you laugh and warm your heart. Anyway, thank you for making this podcast. I'm enjoying catching up on episodes during quarantine and revisiting treasured memories and learning new spiritual truths in these books. Further up and further in, and may the force be with you, Anna in Sydney, Australia.
Oh, very nice. Thank you for sending that in, Anna. That is great. Jared, while we have you here, this is going to now be like our new litmus test to see if people can come back on the show. Are you a fan of the Dufflepuds, or do you dislike them?
I am pro Dufflepud.
Dufflepud. It's been great having you on the show, Jared. Thank you so much. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
One of the reasons I like them is because I mentioned that I really like those BBC productions. Uh-huh. And the Dufflepuds are just so weird in how they render them with like their costuming and stuff in those that I watched as a kid. So I just have this weird affection for them.
All right. Well, I'll go ahead and finish this out. But before we do that, Jared, we are so thankful that you've been on the show. We just want to extend our gratitude to you. You've brought so many great things here. I know a lot of our listeners have learned a lot from you.
All right. Thank you so much. This has been great. And keep up the good work, guys.
Jared, one thing I wanted to say is I read this chapter all the way through, and then I read it through again, and I just found so much more stuff when I read it the second time. But then discussing it with you and Daniel today, I feel like I found an entire third layer of stuff, and I just really appreciate that. Studying this this entire series has been a blast so far, and I feel like you really brought a lot to the table, and I wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And so, listeners, if you have enjoyed hearing Jared's thoughts, go ahead in the episode's description, or you can just Google Matins and Augustinian. I'll have both links for that, so for people to go find your podcast, Jared.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, this episode has been made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to Elias Dean, Hannah Anderson, John Marr, and Emily Margaret for supporting us at the Care Paravel level. You can follow us into Narnia on our Twitter or Facebook pages, and if you have any feedback, you can email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. As always, we would appreciate a review over on Apple Podcasts because this helps other listeners find the show and join together on our read-through. Thank you for coming along for this journey, and we'll be back next time with Chapter 3.